Okay, everybody, we got to kind of be flexible and adjust in a time like this. I know Zoom has been kind of on the fritz today, and I sent out a message to you guys over Google Classroom just to be prepared for today's lesson. So I'm going to load this video up, and I want you guys to watch just to kind of go along with what we are going to cover today. Now, of course, we have been talking about, and I'm just going to kind of run through the slideshow, and of course, this is kind of what you would see if we were doing our Zoom. But we have been talking about the first four major civilizations. Okay, we talked about early man, and we talked about that there was this massive shift from food gathering to food producing. Okay, where people were known as hunter gatherers, and then what happened was because they understood, because people started to realize that if you planted your plants in the ground, it would be a renewable source of food, like vegetables and fruits. And if you got animals and you bred those animals, that would be a renewable source of food that you could continue to have. Now, of course, this was the birth of farming and ranching. And of course, if you are farming and ranching, you cannot be nomadic. You cannot go travel from place to place to place. You have to set up permanent settlements in order to take care of those plants and take care of those animals. Now, at the same time, we also see these communities start to form, where they more and more people start moving into these areas, and they start to become bigger. And we see, like we had talked about last week, the emergence of three different types of groups. Okay, the first group is going to be the warrior class, because people also realize very quickly that I could just easily take what you have rather than me keep, or rather than me work to kind of make it. I can just take what you have. So, of course, people had to defend themselves. They had to have these warriors, these soldiers to defend these villages. Then you also had the priest class that came about, because we see that this idea of religion started to come out, where all these villages had different gods, and they protected the village, and they gave misfortune to those that kind of crossed the people in the village. It was a form of control, a form of government that kind of tried to keep the people on the straight and narrow and have them following the laws. The next group that we see that starts to kind of emerge at this time is going to be the merchant class. And especially when we talk about the first four major civilizations, like Egypt or Mesopotamia and Sumer and India that we already talked about, or China that we'll talk about today, we see that these merchants start traveling to all these different locations. And when they travel into these areas, they not only trade items, they start trading ideas. And the big point that we made was that these merchants started writing down how these trading forays went. They said we made money, or we lost, made money. We traded these things for those things, and things went good. And they started kind of pointing to, yes, this happened on this day. And like I had told you guys before, that when we see that idea of this happened on this day and here's how it went down, this began this was the beginning of recorded history, where they actually started to have a written form of communication, a written language. Now, the early written form of communication that we talked about that came from Mesopotamia and Sumer was known as cuneiform. All right, now that was using symbol writing. Okay, and what they did with cuneiform was they got a soft clay tablet, they got a stylus, and they would press different, like, three-dimensional shapes into that clay tablet. Of course, those symbols, they would stand for words, ideas, sentences, all of that. Then we talked about in Egypt, for example, they had their own form of writing. That was called hieroglyphs, and what those were picture writing, where a picture could stand for, again, a word or a sentence or a sound or things like that. Now, we also spoke about India. Now, in India, they have their own form of writing called Sanskrit, but the problem was their form of writing, we do not have an interpretation for their form of writing now. So a lot of early Indian civilization and the Harappan civilization, we are doing generalizations on those. We don't know exactly how it went down. We just know that, with the Indians, in the Indians' case, they were very, very organized when it came to city planning. Their cities were built with right angles, and the streets intersected at right angles to maximize their space. Okay, so they were very forward thinking. We also see that in the early Harappan society, we also see that they have sewers, they have water that was available to all the people that lived there. So these were big innovations, big step forward in technology that we see in the Harappan or the Indian early civilizations. Now, the problem with them, and we had kind of talked about before, was that the Indians, we see that, or the Harappans, their civilization was thriving, and then all of a sudden their civilization just cuts off. It's just gone. And we don't know exactly what happened, okay? It could have been a disease. It could have been a natural disaster. I mean, today, you know, we have diseases and natural disasters, but our technology is high enough that we can, you know, that cities aren't just lost forever. I mean, you probably don't remember this, but, you know, way back when Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans, I mean, if this was back in ancient times, the city of New Orleans would probably be lost forever, would be gone. But now we're able to kind of recover and fix the city, and then the cities can stay alive. They don't just die out because of this thing. Well, this very well may have been what happened to the Harappan civilization. I mean, there may have been an earthquake or a tsunami or some kind of major flood, and it destroyed their city, it destroyed their civilization, and they just kind of ended, okay? Now, it could have been, like I said, it could have been a disease. It could have been even being invaded by another group. But we just know that they abruptly had a cutoff. Now, today, we're going to get into the fourth of the first four major civilizations, okay? Now, and we're going to talk about China. Now, about 500 years after the settlement of the Indus River Valley, China's first civilization emerged in the fertile plains along the Hanghe or the Yellow River. Now, what we're talking about when we talk about the Yellow River or the Hanghe is going to be right up in here. If you can see my cursor moving around, this is going to be where we see this civilization starts out, okay? Now, as in the Nile and the Indus River valleys, the fertility of the soil along the Hanghe was increased by the river's periodic floods. Now, of course, you're going to see a lot of floods here, and of course, you know, they will have their own ideas about irrigation, okay? Now, we talked about the irrigation techniques that they used in places like India, they used in Mesopotamia and Sumer, and they used in Egypt. But China is going to have it a little bit different. Now, of course, we talked about how those merchants kind of shared those ideas, and they communicated with each other, they were aware of each other. But in China, it's going to be a little bit different. Now, what am I doing again? This is going to be a really sophisticated cut here, but let me switch around to my nice whiteboard here. And I'm going to kind of give you an idea about what irrigation was like in China. Now, the problem with this river, this Yellow River, and the reason why they called it the Yellow River is because the bottom of the river was covered in this yellow sand, okay? This yellow sand that was called loess. Now, the thing about the yellow sand was it was very, very light. It was very silty. Okay, and if you've ever been to, let's say, the river, you ever gone tubing, or like up in San Marcos or in New Braunfels or anywhere like that, you'll know that like there's this light layer of dirt that's right above the bottom of the river. Okay, now that dirt is, you know, it's very light, but it's there. Okay, you can kind of shuffle your feet through it. You can kind of feel it. It is what it is. Now above the river, of course, this is where you have your river, your water. Okay, now what the people of ancient China would do was they would build dams. Okay, so if you wanted to prevent flooding in an area that was downriver from here, you would build a dam. Okay, and they would build that dam straight up above the water line, and they would cut off all that water flow. Okay, now this is all well and good, and you know, of course, they would build these dams, and you know, we'll see dams all throughout history. But the problem with this dam, and of course with this loess that we see on the bottom, is that loess has nowhere to flow. It does not flow downriver. It does not go anywhere. So what we see is that over time, this loess is going to build up, and it's going to cause the bed of the river to start rising and rising. Okay. Now what it does is when that starts to rise, we will see that the water level will rise as well, and before you know it, the river is going to flow over the top of the dam. Okay, so the people of ancient China, their solution to this was to build even higher dams. Okay, well, what's going to end up happening is they will just continue to build that dam up. The bottom of the river will continue to rise, and it will cause that water to continue to rise. All right, now what this does is it makes a major ecological change to this area, wherein this river is now flowing much higher than it should. Now, it's going to take some time before they start learning some of the other irrigation techniques to kind of combat this, but we see that, yes, early China, they're going to have many run-ins with problems with flooding because of this very reason right here, because of you know, the increasingly building of these dams, making them go up and up and up. Okay, so let's flip back over here. All right. Okay, so So anyway, so that's going to be kind of a problem with them, and as far as their agriculture goes, their environment stuff. But they will learn these irrigation techniques. They will dig these trenches. They will relieve the water, and that swells a lot of these rivers, and so they'll make things a little easier for them at that point. Now, of course, like we said, of course the soil was very fertile all along the Hanghe River or the Yellow River. They're kind of the same. Anyway, around 4500 BC, people along the Hanghe began growing millet, which is a type of grain. Later, they learned to farm soybeans and raise chickens, dogs, and pigs. So, of course, they domesticated these chickens, dogs, and pigs. Of course, they would use the chickens and pigs for meat. Of course, they would raise a lot of grains and rice and things like that they would eat as far as the vegetation. Now, the leadership there in China is going to be very similar to what we saw in Egypt, where Egypt had the pharaoh, and they had kind of this monarchy or a dynasty of rulers that came through. Okay, well, in China, about 1700 BC, a ruling family or a dynasty known as the Shang took power. Now, in China, you're going to kind of mark their history by the dynasty that was in control. So this is going to be the earliest dynasty that we know of, known as the Shang. All right. They built the first Chinese cities and established their capital at Anyang near the Hanghe River. The Shang ruled with the help of powerful nobles. Shang kings were military leaders. They were also high priests who offered sacrifices to their royal ancestors. Now, the early form of religion that we are going to see in China at this time is going to be more of an ancestor worship. And we're going to see that this is going to be very similar, or we're going to see this becomes very big when it comes to family in China. Okay, they are going to say that instead of praying to a certain god, that you would pray to a family member that had died long before. I mean, many of us, in this lesson, and you probably obviously know your family. You probably know your mom and your dad and your grandparents, and some of us may know our great grandparents. But in China, it was very important to not only know your great-grandparents, but to know like your great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandparents and uncles and aunts and all these different people that were in your family tree. Because you would then turn and you would pray to these different ancestors to give you good fortune and to help you out, okay? Again, like if one of your ancestors was a great warrior, you could pray to this great warrior if you were going into battle. Or if one was a great farmer, you could pray to them for a good crop, let's say. Okay, now this is why in China they had an extreme respect for people that were older, the elderly, because again, you want to be nice to this person because they're close to death, and when they die, you want them to give you good fortune. So of course, they had a lot of respect for their older people there in China as a result. Okay, now as I mentioned, of course, these leaders, these ruling families, they were, of course, the military leaders. They were also a spiritual leader. So, of course, they were trying to be in tune with these ancestors, the people who came before them and became before you and all of that. Okay? Now, the people living in the Hanghe Valley were skilled at many crafts. Their ability in bronze work can be seen in many objects surviving from the period. Now, as we see here in this slide that I'm showing you, they also were the first to make silk textiles from silkwood cocoons. This isn't silk, but you'll see. They also developed a system of writing with pictographs known as characters. Now, each character ended up representing one word. So we're all probably familiar with this writing here, this Chinese writing or these Chinese symbols. But understand, these writings, much like the cuneiform, much like even the hieroglyphics that we saw in Egypt, they were very artistic. Okay, they were very very delicate and very, very difficult to write. So what happens is that these people that were the scribes that definitely could write this stuff, they were definitely very revered in their society because they were basically artists. Okay, they would bring these very complex characters to life. Now, understand, it took a long time to write a lot of things out. You couldn't just, write freehand, kind of like we would be used to today. And again, like I said, it was seen as an art form. All right, and this was their form of writing. And of course, when they would write from top down. Okay, so how we would normally read from left to right, they would read from top to bottom. Okay, now with all this in mind, okay, of course, these their pictorial characteristics were often only minor modifications. Okay, and a lot of times they are, even today, they are still used in the Chinese written language today. Even though speaking different dialects use the same characteristics. Now, that is a very important thing because we're going to see that in China, because it is so large, and I'll go back to this map, because it kind of encompasses a large area of land here, you're going to have a very diverse population. A lot of different people that speak different dialects and different types of languages. And the thing is that, yes, this character writing was intended to be a language that could be read no matter what dialect you used, okay? Even though it was very complex, but it was something that was a universal, written language amongst all of them, okay? Now, also when it came to China, please understand, they had kind of an air of superiority about them, okay? In their beliefs, and again, when you look at their early origins, and we'll talk about this more so when we talk about China specifically, they are going to believe that in their early religions, that right here, where you see present-day Beijing, okay, they're going to say that in their early origins, the very first man in history emerged from the ground in Beijing, okay? Now, what they're going to say is because that happened, this Beijing is going to be the most culturally civilized place in the world, okay? And what they're going to say is that, yes, this is like the center of the universe. This is the most important city in the world. And the further you get away from Beijing, the more uncivilized you become, okay? So of course, the more uncivilized you become, the less, I guess you could say proper that you were. So we're going to see they have kind of this attitude there in China. So when they do come into contact with the people, let's say coming from India to trade, or the Middle East to trade, or Egypt, or even later on when people from Europe start to come into China, they're going to view a lot of these people as barbarians, as being uncivilized because they are so far away from China. Okay, so just kind of keep that in mind again when we get into China a little bit later on. Okay, now of course we have the character writing. We also see kind of these rivers right here. We kind of mentioned that as well. Now, what you see here is another thing that they would do, kind of like, they would use what they called oracle bones, okay? Of course, this is the way that they could kind of communicate with their loved ones and kind of communicate, with those that have gone before them. They would take these bones. Now, what this usually was like the shoulder blade of a cow, okay? And they would write these different messages all up and down the shoulder blades. Now, what they would do is they would superheat these bones, and when you superheat them, the bones would start to crack. As you can see, these cracks right here. Well, their belief was that if the crack extended through the words that you wrote, like if you had a message like saying, "Am I going to be rich?" or "Am I going to be powerful?" or "Am I going to have a good harvest?" If a crack went through that part where you wrote, it was their belief that, yes, that was your ancestors communicating to you that, yes, that would happen. If the crack did not extend through those areas, you can see in some of these other parts don't have cracks through them, that means that those things would not happen. So this is just kind of a little view of some of their beliefs, especially when it comes to their communication with their ancestors that came before them. Okay? Now, the last little section here, we're gonna shift a little bit, where we had talked about the first four major civilizations. We talked about, of course, Egypt and Mesopotamia and Sumer, and India and China. Well, today, for the end of today's lesson, we are going to introduce the very first of the 5 major religions that we are going to discuss in this class. Okay, and that religion that we're going to talk about today is Judaism. Now, if you can recall that when we talked about Egypt before, we talked about how in Egypt, of course, a big portion of the population were either peasants, like peasant farmers, or they were slaves. Well, what's going to happen is there's going to be a group of people that kind of wander into this area known as the Hebrews. And these Hebrews are going to be captured by the Egyptians and enslaved, okay? Now, it's going to be from these Hebrews that we see this religion of Judaism is going to emerge. Now, today we're going to talk about some of their basic beliefs, and we're going to talk about pretty much like one of the central events in Judaism, okay, what the Jewish people believe when we talk about the Exodus from Egypt, okay, and the life of, first of all, we'll talk about Abraham, and then we'll talk about a guy named Moses, okay? So just kind of, again, we're going to talk about what the beliefs were. Like I've said before, and I always kind of preface this when we talk about the religions, at no time am I trying to convert anybody or make you think any different than you already think. I'm just telling you kind of what is believed. Now, again, some of y'all probably have known these stories or heard of these stories before, so we'll talk about them as far as what the overall belief is, okay? So we'll start right here, okay? Now the ancient, now of course you see this area right here. This is kind of the land right here we see between Egypt and Mesopotamia and Sumer, okay? Now the ancient Hebrews or Israelites lived south of Phoenicia in an area occupied by present-day Israel, Lebanon, and Jordan, okay? And you can kind of see some of those, some of those areas right there. Because of their location, the Hebrews were deeply influenced by the civilizations of both Mesopotamia and Egypt. According to tradition, the forefather of the Hebrews was a man named Abraham. Now, Abraham had grown up in Mesopotamia, in the city of Ur, and later, Abraham moved to Israel. Now, the thing about Abraham is this. Abraham is going to have lots and lots of kids, okay? In fact, he's going to have 12. And these 12 kids are going to be responsible for what they call the 12 tribes of Judaism, okay? And so they're all going to kind of branch out across the desert, and they're all going to have their own little branch of Judaism that will be present. Now, the thing about Abraham is that Abraham, let's go and talk about this way. Unlike other ancient people, the Hebrews did not believe in many gods, okay? So this is going to kind of set them apart, especially from the religions in this area. If we can recall again, Mesopotamia and Sumer, they believed in thousands of gods. And in Egypt, of course, they believed in multiple gods as well. Well, they were going around saying, no, there's only one God, and that is it. Now, that one God, and they said that God's name was Yahweh. Now, Yahweh is going to look a little different than, if let's just say you're Christians, or how you would kind of view the Christian God. Back then, Yahweh was seen as being a vengeful God and a God to kind of fear. All right. Now, later on, they'll adjust that to saying, yes, God can be loved. But at first, it was kind of seen as God was being vengeful. And you'll see some ways that God was vengeful. And we'll kind of talk about a couple stories where, that kind of shows, where God is kind of testing you. But understand, it was a little different view of God at this time than we would view God today in our religions, or in our more modern religions, that is. Now, like it says, of course, instead they believed in one universal God who was both just and all-powerful. All right, this new religion was called Judaism. Jews did not believe that God had human characteristics or a head or a body of an animal, like we see in Mesopotamia, Sumer, and Egypt. Now, when it came to Abraham, and I guess you can say kind of, an example of how God kind of tests the faith and the view of God, it kind of goes along with this. And of course, if you talk about Abraham, this is one of the big stories of Abraham and one of the things that he did. Well, God and the devil basically went to God and said, look, I'm going to test you. I want you to pick your favorite son of earth, and I want you to show me or see if their faith is intact. So what God said was, okay, Abraham is my favorite of all my children, and I want you to test him. So what God does is God goes to Abraham, and God says, you need to take your firstborn son. And now his firstborn son was Isaac. And he said, you will go out into the desert and you will sacrifice Isaac in my name. Okay, now think about that real quick. He's been told to go out and kill his firstborn son. I mean, that's kind of a crazy thing. I mean, it's really, if anybody told you that, you would look at them like they were nuts. But God has commanded this of Abraham. And of course, they're doing this as a test of Abraham's faith. So Abraham, of course, is really kind of distraught about this situation, but very quietly he goes over and takes his Isaac's hand, and walks him out into the desert. Now, of course, Isaac is asking, what are we doing? What's going on? And he takes him out and he builds an altar like you see on the picture right here. And he's getting ready to sacrifice his son, to kill his son in the name of God. Well, the devil appears, okay? And the devil's going to show up and say, hey, what are you doing? This is crazy. You don't have to do this. This is your son, and you don't let. But Abraham was so focused with his faith that he actually took a rock and he threw it at the devil and made the devil go away. Well, the devil came back 2 more times, telling him this is crazy. And every time that he came back, Abraham threw another rock at him. Now, right then, after he had basically denied the devil 3 times, had cast him away, Abraham rose this knife above his head, getting ready to kill his firstborn son. And at that moment, God came down very quickly and stopped him. Okay, they stopped him and said, look, you've proven your faith. You were tested by the devil and you have come out on the other end. So So you are going to be rewarded with your faith. And basically the reward was that Isaac got to live, and they basically gave him a goat in Isaac's place that they can then sacrifice. Now, this story is basically there to show you that yes, you must have faith. Now, am I saying everybody go out and sacrifice people? Absolutely not. That's not the point of the story. The point is that all of us have to have faith in something and have to believe. And there's going to be people and there's going to be things out there that are going to try and detract you and try to make you lose your focus and guide you in a wrong path. And the belief was that you must stay focused and you must always go forward and do what's right, okay, and do what the faith wants you to do, okay, and what God wants you to do, okay. So that's one of the big stories of Judaism. One of the big kind of original stories, or the beliefs there, is about Abraham and his son Isaac. Now, another big story is going to happen in Egypt. Now, and a lot of you guys have heard this story before, and I'm just going to kind of go through it. I'm going to run through it very quickly. I'm not going to go every little thing, but again, this story is very, very key to a lot of the early faith of Judaism. Okay, now one of these tribes, like we said, the 12 different sons of Abraham were wandering the desert. Well, one of these tribes is going to go into Egypt, and when they go to Egypt, they get captured and they get enslaved. Okay, so these slaves are going to be in Egypt for years upon years upon years. Now, of course, these Jewish people are going to be kind of viewed as being God's people, and God's people have been enslaved. Okay, so they are going to be enslaved for many years. Okay, and we talk about the building of the pyramids and all these construction projects and all this terrible treatment. Well, these slaves are going to be treated extremely harshly. Okay, well, what they're going to do, and the Egyptians kind of realize that if these Jewish people that we have as slaves continue to have children, if they have boys and boys and boys, they're going to all of a sudden have an army that could always rise up against us. Like we talked about before. I mean, about 80 to 90% of the population were peasant farmers and slaves. So you can't have a population that gets too out of control. So Pharaoh is going to make a law that said that all these Jewish people, these Hebrews, can only have one son, and that is it. Now, this doesn't say you can't have like multiple daughters, but you can only have one son. Now think about how nerve-wracking that would be for a woman that was pregnant. Because, of course, back then they didn't have ultrasounds or ways of determining the sex or the gender of the child. So it was like nerve-wracking the entire time while you were pregnant, ladies, that, when you had this child, if it was a boy, the boy would be taken away from you. Hold on a second, let that bell stop ringing. Okay, the boy would be taken away from you. So this happens to one lady in particular. She already had a son. She already had a daughter as well. And she is pregnant. And when she gives birth to another son, okay? Now, this son's name is going to be Moses. And you can see Moses right here. This kind of gives away the story a little bit. But what's going to happen is that she is not going to allow the Egyptians to take her brand new baby and kill it. So she takes Moses down to the river, down to the Nile River, and puts him in a basket that floats and pushes him down the river. Now, you could talk about it being divine intervention, that God kind of had a plan, or whatever the case may be. But this little basket with this little newborn baby goes down the Nile and actually ends up inside the palace of Pharaoh. Okay, there was a little area there they had where the water kind of came through the palace, and all of a sudden, this basket with this child in it is gonna come up to Pharaoh's wife. And when Pharaoh's wife sees the baby, of course, she opens up the basket, sees the baby, and she falls in love with the baby. Okay, she does not get upset and all these other things. She sees the baby and she falls in love with the baby. Okay, now what she's going to do is she decides to raise that child as her own. Okay, her own baby. So what happens is that Pharaoh already had a son, an older son, and like we talked about the other day, the older son is going to be the next in line to be the next Pharaoh. Okay, the older son's name is going to be Ramses, and we had kind of talked about him a little bit when we talked about the Sphinx. Anyway, so Ramses is going to be the older brother of Moses, and he is going to be raised as a son or a prince of Egypt, one of the sons of Egypt. Okay, now. Of course, Moses' true mother saw where this basket went, and she understands that, yes, that is actually her son that's raised as a prince. And of course, Moses is not going to know any different. He's going to be raised, in wealth and fortune and all these great things. And he's going to be a reckless teenager, and he's going to just be like everybody else would be. Well, one day, Moses' actual blood older brother, his name was Aaron. And Aaron is going to run into Moses one day in the market. And basically Aaron is kind of tired of his crap and says, look, you're not a prince of Egypt. You are one of us. You are actually one of our people. You're not a son of a prince of Egypt. Okay, so this is going to kind of rock Moses to the point where, he kind of starts to realize, I don't know if God kind of intervenes, and he realizes that yes, he truly is one of the Hebrews. He is not a prince of Egypt. Well, at that time, of course, when he sees all this stuff, he is going to see an Egyptian guard beating a slave, a Hebrew, and he goes and kind of intervenes and ends up kind of pushing this guard, and the guard falls from a high ledge and falls down and dies, right? Well, Moses gets so scared that he basically runs off into the desert, okay? He escapes Egypt, he runs into the desert, and of course, while he's in the desert, and this is, he's like probably in his, teenage years, like maybe 16, 17, 18, years old. He goes into the desert and he runs into one of these tribes of Abraham, one of these 12 tribes of Judaism. Well, he moves in with them. He starts to kind of learn the ways. He actually takes a wife at this time, and he basically starts living his life as a goat herder, okay? And that's pretty much it, a shepherd of these sheep. And he's completely happy living his life this way. Well, one day, while he's out kind of tending to his flock, he sees a major commotion in the distance. And again, he's living a quiet life. And he goes and he witnesses something. And the thing that he sees is a bush that's on fire, okay? But the bush is not sending off any kind of like heat. It's just sending off light. And it's going to look very similar to this right here. Now, he's going to approach this bush, and the bush is going to speak to him, okay? Now, this bush is going to say, first of all, remove your shoes, you are on sacred land. And now, again, a lot of people theorize about what exactly was here. Was this where the Garden of Eden was? Is this where the tree of life was that Eve had eaten from, and it was kind of this burning bush? Nobody really knows. But he hears this voice, and it says, remove your shoes, you are on sacred land. And the voice is going to be the voice of God. And he says, I am Yahweh, I am the Alpha, and I am the Omega. And what do you mean by it? It means by the Alpha and the Omega. Of course, this will be, Greek terminology later on. But Alpha basically is the beginning of the Greek alphabet. Omega is the ending of the Greek alphabet. So basically, this is God saying, I am the beginning and the end. I am all things. I am God. I am Yahweh. All right. Now, he's going to say, Moses, you are one of my sons, and I am going to leave it up to you to go and save our people from slavery. He's like, I've had enough of my people being enslaved to the Egyptians. You will go and you will save them. Okay? Now, he says, I'm going to give you this staff, and this staff will have my power in it. But you are going to be the one that's going to go and talk to your brother. Because he says, since you've been gone, your brother Ramses has become the Pharaoh. And you will talk to Pharaoh, and you will get him to free the slaves. Now, again, you look at the test that Abraham had with Isaac. Moses is going to be tested as well. Because God says, listen, I am going to make Pharaoh's heart cold. He goes, I am going to make Pharaoh tell you no. Because Egypt has had our people way too long, and Egypt needs to get a little revenge. They need to know what it's like. So he says, you're going to tell your brother to let your people go, and he's going to say no, and he is going to be punished for it. Okay? And I mean, think about that. Moses and Ramses were very, very close together. They were very close. They were like best friends, even though they're brothers and best friends their whole life. And he's basically saying, look, you're going to go there, and your brother is about to be punished, and you've got to just kind of take it. So Moses, with a heavy heart, takes this staff that God has given him. His power is going to be in his shepherd staff, and he's going to get his wife, and they are going to travel back to Egypt. Okay, now they are going to go into Egypt, and of course, Moses is going to approach Ramses, and of course, Ramses is going to be overjoyed. I mean, it's been years since Moses was gone, And Ramses is going to be like, man, my brother, great seeing you, man. You should have come back. And I mean, he's just overjoyed to see Moses. And Moses kind of turns to him and goes, look, here's kind of the situation. And I've spoken to the one true God. And these Hebrews are their people. Your slaves are their people. And you need to let them go. You need to free these slaves. And of course, true to God's word, God said they will not be, God said that Ramses' heart would be cold, and his heart got cold. In fact, he got enraged that Moses would even ask such a question. And so Moses said, okay, I'm just letting you know what's going to happen. So he kind of walks off. Well, at this time, to kind of punish Egypt, we see that the plagues start to hit Egypt. Okay? Now, every time one of these plagues hit, Moses goes back and asks Ramses to let his people go, and Ramses says no. So what we're going to see is that first, we'll have swarms of locusts will come in. Okay? And these swarms of locusts will basically eat up all the crops in the fields. They'll also start stinging and biting. The flies will sting and bite everybody and kind of, make everybody miserable. We'll also see people start getting sick and dying. We'll see the plague of the boils and the sores, where people get these massive boils and sores all over their body, and they're starting to die from that. We'll see the frogs start raining from the sky. Okay, we'll see the Nile is going to be turned to blood. Okay, well, when the Nile turns to blood, they can't drink it. The fish die in the Nile. The animals can't drink that water. So of course it makes it toxic to people. Okay, he also starts to rain down hellfire and brimstone from the sky, where basically just giant fireballs will come from the sky. So you see all of these plagues, and every time Moses comes back and says, let my people go, Ramses says no. Okay, now the final time, and God comes to Moses and goes, listen, you're going to go back one more time, and you are going to talk to Ramses. Okay, now he says, I'm going to lift my spell from his heart. I'm not going to make his heart cold anymore. He says, you will go in and you will ask him, and Ramses will answer honestly. Okay, so understand, with all of this stuff happening, Ramses doesn't want to see Moses anymore. In fact, Ramses is upset. He is extremely enraged about what Moses has done, because in his mind, Moses has done this. Now God tells Moses, he says, listen, this last thing I'm going to do is going to be probably the most brutal. Okay, he said that I'm going to go through Egypt tonight. And well, let me backtrack. He goes to Ramses and says, Ramses, let my people go. And of course, Ramses, who is enraged, says, absolutely not. He goes, in fact, I'm going to hunt down and kill every one of these slaves before I ever let them free. Okay, so Moses goes out to the people. Now, at this point, with all these things going on, understand, it's not just the Hebrews anymore. A lot of just the regular people of Egypt are all kind of all siding with Moses. Even some of the guards, the warriors are siding with Moses. Well, Moses goes, listen, God is going to send the angel of death into Egypt tonight. Okay, and he says, listen, if you are a believer, you will take lamb's blood and you will smear it across your door tonight. And when the angel of death comes through and he sees lamb's blood on your door, the angel of death will pass your door and go to somebody else's door. And he says, the angel of death will come and take all of the firstborn sons of Egypt. Okay? Now, Ramses, understand at this time, like we talked about Pharaohs before, he had a son that was going to be the next in line. Now, this son was a baby at this time. And he says, this baby was going to be Pharaoh after Ramses passed away. And probably more than anything, I mean, Ramses, of course, loved Ramses. He loved himself, but he probably loved his first son more than anything else in the world. Well, that night, the people of Egypt go home and they shut those doors, and the believers put that blood on the door. Well, that night, the angel of death comes through and takes all of, and basically takes all the firstborn sons of Egypt, including Ramses' son. All right? Well, Ramses is just a broken man at this time. And Moses' heart is broken for his brother. And he goes and he says, let my people go. And of course, Ramses, who's kind of a broken man at this time, says, just take them. Just leave. Get out of Egypt. Never come back. I never want to see you again. Just get out. So we'll go to that in a second. Moses and his people leave. Now understand, this is called the Exodus. This is the mass exit of these Hebrews from Egypt. Okay, now God promised them the land of milk and honey, basically saying there's going to be a very plentiful land that you will have out in the desert, but you need to go to it. So Moses and all these Hebrews, and like I said, a lot of the Egyptian citizens that now are believing what Moses is saying, they all leave at the same time, and they go off into the desert. Now, as they walk through the desert, of course, as they all get out of Egypt, Ramses, again, goes from this massive depression and sorrow. He shifts very quickly into rage and says, we will kill all of these people. So, of course, he loads up all of his men on their chariots, and they race off into the desert to try to chase down all of these fleeing slaves. Well, what's going to happen is Moses and his people will approach the Red Sea. Okay, that's just not too far away from Egypt. Well, when they get to that Red Sea, of course, they know that Ramses and his men are hot on their tail. Well, what Moses will do is he will take that shepherd's crook, that shepherd's staff that God said he would put his power in. He walked out into the Red Sea, put it in the Red Sea, and of course the sea is going to part. God will open up the sea and allow these people to cross through. Okay? Now, when they get safely across, of course, Ramses and his men are hot on their tails and running across. Well, God is going to have the waters recede and wash away Pharaoh and his men. And of course, the Jews, the Hebrews, are going to escape, and they are going to get away. Okay? Now, when they get away, of course, they then are kind of left to wander the desert. Now, what's going to happen is that God's plan for these Hebrews is going to kind of change a little bit, because he's going to find that these Hebrews are going to start kind of looking all over the place for anything, for God, for what they believe is God. Now, we're going to see that they're going to get a little astray. In fact, there'll be a time where they create this golden cow, this statue of a golden cow, and they'll worship it. Well, this kind of makes God upset. And because of this, he decides to punish them by having them wander the desert for the next 40 years. Okay, just wander the desert looking for this land of milk and honey that they could not find at this point. Now, because again, they kind of were astray, and as they were wandering in the desert, they were next to this giant mountain called Mount Sinai, and God will call Moses to the top of Mount Sinai. Excuse me. And when he goes to the top of Mount Sinai, God will speak to Moses. Okay, so again, here on this map, you can see, of course, when they crossed over the Red Sea, you can see them kind of going through the desert. And of course, once they get down here to Mount Sinai that we see on the bottom of this map, God will call Moses up to the top of Mount Sinai and says, I am going to give you basically the rules. I'm going to tell you, these are the commandments that people must live their life by. Okay? And he speaks these 10 commandments to Moses, okay? Because he saw that the Hebrew people were straying from this, okay? So much like the Code of Hammurabi, this becomes kind of the law code for their religion, okay? And I'm sure we've all heard of the 10 commandments. And of course, Moses brings these tablets back down from the mountain to show the people and to have them follow what God's plan was. Now, these 10 commandments are the following. Now, what we see on these, and we'll kind of talk about what each of them are, but understand, some of these define what your relationship with God should be. The other one defines what your relationship should be, or the other ones, define what your relationship with everybody else should be. So, for example, thou shalt have no other gods before me. So when people were worshiping a golden calf, that was really upsetting God. And he said, because we are monotheistic, we believe in one God, and that is it. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image. What that means is, and like we kind of talked about earlier, they didn't see God. And I know a lot of times when I say God, a lot of people kind of interpret it as like a white guy with a big white beard and like white robes. But basically they're saying God did not have an image. God does not have a face or a body. None of that stuff. So you can't make an image of showing that this is what God is. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. So, of course, the name of God, Yahweh, is not one to be just taken lightly, okay? You can't just throw it around. Now, of course, a lot of people do that nowadays. They say, oh my God, about this and this and this. They're saying that, yeah, it should have some weight to it. You should not just be throwing around the name of God. Now, the next, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. So, of course, like, in Christianity, people go to church on Sundays. You keep that day holy. That's kind of what is believed there. Now, of course, we talk about that. The first 4 are basically your relationship with God. And then after that, this is going to be your relationship with other people. So, of course, honor thy mother and thy father. Okay. That basically means that, yes, you must respect your mom and your dad. Thou shalt not kill. Now, again, there's some different interpretations to this. I believe the actual interpretation, the original interpretation was thou shalt not murder. Okay, so granted, somebody's hurting you and you kill them, or you go to war and you kill somebody, it doesn't mean you're going to hell. Of course, if you're out doing it maliciously, that's a different story. Thou shalt not commit adultery, okay, which means basically you should not cheat on your husband or your wife, okay? Now, there's many different variations of this, okay? And like I said, it could be anything from the physical act of doing something or just thinking about someone else, okay? But so those are things you have to kind of control and be disciplined with your actions and in your brain, excuse me. Thou shalt not steal. That's pretty self-explanatory. You should not steal things from other people. Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. That basically means you should not lie. Okay? And then, of course, thou shalt not covet. Now, covet basically means the wanting of something that somebody else has. Now, the problem is that our entire economy is based on covet. I mean, if somebody gets the brand new iPhone, you're going to want the brand new iPhone. If somebody gets the brand new car, you're going to want the brand new car. But what they're saying here is you should not consume yourself with what other people have and be envious of what other people have. Okay? So that's going to be the big one. Now, these fundamentals are going to be kind of what becomes known eventually as Judeo-Christian ethics, okay? And these are basically 10 ideas that people use to kind of form the ethics and morality of a lot of these civilizations that start to pop up, especially in places like Europe when they adopt Christianity, okay? They're going to definitely want, kind of adopt these 10 commandments as being kind of their fundamental rules that they have, okay? Okay, so let's see. So that is where we are going to wrap up for today. It was a pretty good lesson. I mean, like I said, hopefully you guys will get this. And of course, Zoom hopefully will be back up and running. And I will see you guys on Wednesday. All right. Make sure that you go on. You should be able to complete that Google document with the information about the River Valley civilizations. You can finish all of that. And if you have not turned in the Code of Hammurabi assignment, please get that in. Okay. The quiz, we will talk about that on Wednesday. All right. I will talk to y'all then. All right, bye.